So at the end of your session, don't switch anything off because I'm going to load.
Yeah. Welcome back. I'm instructed to use a military voice. And I think that's so that after lunch we're maybe feeling a little sluggish having eaten. So the military voice will help reanimate us, and also the pure intellectual stimulation of this panel will also help animate us. So we begin with Emmanuelle Vagnon, who is a researcher at CNRS in Paris, and she'll be speaking to us about Portolan charts in French and German archives, new discoveries.
I have to put the screen, you remember? This one?
Presentation mode.
This one? No? Maybe. Is it okay? No. No, it's not.
I think, can we try
Where
that
is
one?
This one?
That one, yeah.
Can't get to read the text.
There we go.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. So I'm very glad to be there for this second workshop about Portolan cards. And in this workshop about the birth and evolution of Portolan cards, my aim is to present some new cards that recently came to light. First, last year, the Department Archives of Draguignan in France, the Department of the Var, near Toulon, advised me about an anonymous and undated Portolan card discovered in a binding of notarial acts. I was invited, along with Jacques Mille, to examine the card and evaluate its date and provenance. I will first present this totally new item, which should be added to the Portolan cards database. Moreover, a few years ago, two magnificent Portolan cards from a private collection belonging to Mr. Kurt von Figura were donated to the University Library in Heidelberg, Germany. Our regretted colleague and friend Corradino Astengo first made mention of these cards, and I went to Heidelberg to see them, but I had no opportunity to present them so far. So I would like to dedicate this presentation to his memory. I will present these cards and replace them within the frame of the Renaissance map productions. Like other painted Portolan cards, these documents witness a market for ornamental maritime cards. They thus raise the question of the scientific status and the social function of such nautical cards in the 15th and in the 16th century. Let's start with the Draguignan map that you can see on the screen. The card was designed on a whole piece of parchment, then was cut and wrapped around a book. researcher in the Var archive, a lady, used to study notary archives, saw the colors of the map by transparency while opening the book. It was in February 2022, last year, just after the beginning of the current war in Ukraine. She was amazed to discover here a map of Crimea, here, and the Black Sea. So it was the first fragment to be discovered. Therefore, she asked the curators about this strange document and the presence of a Portolan card in a binding. So the curator of the Var archives gently gave us some photos of the book before the restoration of the map. So the book was that had this map as a cover was the register of a notary of South France. His name and the date of the register are clearly written, as you can see, Jacques Jurat de Soliès, Soliès being a small village near Toulon. This book belongs to a series of registers dated from 1591 to 1597. Then we know that the card was made before this date. Other registers were looked carefully, and other fragments, the West Mediterranean, was found and proved to be from the same card. So, as you can see, the map was the cover of the register. And you can see that the lady who discovered this strange binding just opened the book and saw the Portolan card inside. And you can see on those images also the traces of ink and humidity there. So one detail showed that the card was no more considered as a valuable document in the 16th century, but only used for the parchment. The notary has written Monsieur here, you see, probably to try his pen in the Mediterranean, near the island of Cyprus. The ink of the card, especially the ink of the red heraldic banners, unloaded on the opposite white page because of some humidity. At some point of its history, the document was obviously damaged by water. So, about the restoration of the card, the binding was taken off and replaced by some new parchment and a new white cover. Then the card was put in a humidifier box, as you can see there, with appropriate hygrometric conditions to soften the parchment and make the veil or sheepskin recover its original shape, surface, and colors. Then, as you can see, the technician let the map dry with special spins to stretch the parchment very gently. So I don't know exactly the technical name in English of those things to stretch the parchment. Another, and you see the two fragments were put together to see the fragment of the map that are conserved. So, as you may know, this kind of reuse of a card in a binding is not exceptional at all. Tony Campbell had already mentioned this phenomenon in his article in the History of Cartography, the first volume. Afterwards, some other came to light, such as the Lucca card and some other maps, later maps, like the Villarolo map in the notarial archives in Malta in 1575, that was used at the same way later in the 17th century. But regarding the south of France, here are the maps found in this way. We just talked about the Avignon map in the Vaucluse Departmental Archives, but in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, since the 1930s, we have some maps that came also from binding and from the Vaucluse. First, the map attributed to Messia de Villadestes around 1400, but was attributed also by Ramon Pujades to Jafuda Cresque, the son of Abraham Cresques, the supposed author of the Catalan Atlas. Another famous map, but anonymous, coming from binding, is a map attributed to Petrus Rosselli, or Pere Rossell, dated by Julio Pastor and Garcia Camero, around 1468. Another map was attributed to Petrus Russus, this time beginning of the 16th century, 1516. We can add to these 4 maps coming from the Vaucluse department some fragments that came from a notary of Perpignan in the Catalan part of France. And this time you see the fragments, they were signés in the notarial archives. It's not a binding, but it's just pieces of parchment that were put inside the book just to mark the page. There's other maps, for example, the one from Gap, but dating from the 17th century. This time again, this very ornamented map was used as a binding after a certain amount of time. So here you can see the Petrus Russus map, very damaged as the Avignon card you see there. So the binding, you can see the traces of the binding around the book and the hole that were made when the parchment was too old. Alors, very often, the attribution to some authors and the dates given by historians are only based on the appreciation of the historians, and they can differ from one historian to another. Moreover, it does not give many clues about the circumstances of the arrival of the map in the notary archives. We really don't know if the maps were already there in the archives, or, for example, if there was a market of used parchments and the notary were used to buy a lot of used parchments to make their binding after that. That's a question, and we can't really solve this for the moment. For example, on the Avignon card, you have those strange writings on the maps that you mentioned in your book. Those strange writings are probably penned essays from the notary afterwards. And here you say you saw the writing Monsieur. It's a pen writing after the parchment was considered as used. Let's go to the description of the map. So you see the 2 fragments put together, and here the new binding of the volume with new ropes here. Alors, let's see how it is. So let's start with the western part of the map. So the document is composed of 2 fragments displaying the very classical contour and structure of a Portolan cart of the Mediterranean area. Regarding the structure, you have the usual realm lines. You don't have on those fragments the visible scale. And decoration is typical of Mallorcan maps as described traditionally, with the Green Alps divided in 3 branches, the Atlas mountain range in northern Africa with a typical cock-foot shape here. The writing does not show a typical language, Catalan or Italian. It's very difficult to assign it to a Catalan or Italian map maker. And the cities are represented as the usual urban figures, as you can see here. You see the heraldic banners, the realm line, streams, sources, lakes, mountain ranges. And here, the cities. You can see on the western fragment Tlemcen, northern Africa, Avignon, Aigues-Mortes, Genoa, and Venice. But the originality of this map is the presence of Roma, which is quite unusual for such maps in the 15th century, with maybe a special demand of the customer to Another very big city, unusual, is here on the Danube. Maybe it is Regensburg. On the eastern fragment, you see the detail of Roma, with the name of Roma on the Tiber River, and Civitavecchia there. And for the eastern fragment, near the Black Sea, we can recognize the city of Vesina, that used to be a small market city on the Danube in Romagna, near the mouth of the Danube River, near the actual Tulcea. And this city is represented on earlier maps, but in fact, in 15th century, it had no more market importance. And I wonder if sometimes the map makers confused this city with Vidin, maybe, in Bulgaria. You can see on the city, on the eastern map, you can see here Damas, Cairo, that is usually called Babylon, but not here, you don't have the label. You can see the part of the Mount Sinai here, and obviously here, you see that the figure of Jerusalem was cut off by someone, and certainly before the binding of the book. So the importance of Jerusalem as a holy city explains that it was cut off by someone who knew the importance of this vignette, this urban figure. Our colors used for the city figures are special. As you can see, there are red or pink shades and green roofs. Banners are rectangular, except for the triangle banner of Venice. I'll show you again. You have this triangle banner of Venice with red and green tones that were damaged by water. There is no specific attention to a kind of realism in the representation of the city landscapes, except maybe for the Gulf of Genoa here. There is no obvious differences between cities under Christian and Muslim rules. In the Catalan Atlas, for example, you can see round roofs like Coupole for the Oriental cities and crenellati towers or clock towers for Christian cities. But there is no differences here made by the author. Moreover, we can see that on those maps, you have no human or animal figures, no trees, no other ornamental features. So rather decorative but simple map. So some characteristics of those maps are not only those of Mallorcan's map makers, and then for the identification and attribution of this map, the style of the card compared to others show many similarities with two famous Mallorcan artists of the 15th century, that is to say Petrus Rosselli, or Pere Rossel, and Gabriel de Vallseca. Petrus Rosselli is a cartographer known from 4046 to 4089, with 8 signed Portolan cards and at least 6 cards attributed to him. Not much is known of his life. It is sometimes said that he was Italian, but he was trained in Mallorca with Gabriel de Vallseca, and he says he was imitating a Genoese card maker in Mallorca, Battista Beccaria, as you can see on the quote. The beautiful Mappamundi of the Estense Library in Modena is sometimes also attributed to Rosselli. The style of the Draguignan card also strongly remains Gabriel de Vallseca, who is a little more older than the Petrus Rosselli. Alors maybe the difference of spelling and writing could help us to distinguish the two map makers, but so far I could really not make a very big difference between the two possible authors of this map. The writing is more like Petrus Rosselli, but the style is close to its earlier works. So for example, you can see here Gabriel de Vallseca of 1447, kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and you really have similarities between those cities and the cities of the Draguignan map. And all the decoration are very similar. But Petrus Rosselli also made some interesting maps. You see this map dated 4062 in the BNF has similar cities. Those shapes with green and red are similar too. So some features are very close, but we know that they worked together in Mallorca, so it explains the problem. And for the date, I just had many pictures to show you, many maps to show you. I prefer to focus on those ones, just to say that after 4066, Petrus Rosselli had a different style, a much more ornamented style with, you see, figures, tents, Virgin and Child in the neck here, wind roses, and so on. And you don't have those features in the Draguignan map. So I think the author of this map must be Gabriel de Weizsäcker or the young Petrus Rosselli, and before 4065. That's the conclusion for the moment. So such documents were appreciated in the Rhône Valley during the 15th century, and they certainly were brought by Catalan or Italian merchants that were frequently in the Rhône Valley. But we can also say that those maps were not more considered as valuable documents in the middle of the 16th century. Or it was less fashionable, and then the parchment was reused. So it questions the function of those maps. We know that those maps were maps of maritime area, but certainly not nautical tools on board. And we know that those maps were not considered for a long time as valuable documents that were kept in libraries. So let's see now another question with the two Portolan cards now in Heidelberg. The two other maps that I would present to you are much later and different in style. The main difference is that they were not found as reused parchment and binding, but that they were cautiously kept as piece of art in a noble German family collection. I don't know when it entered the family collection, actually. So, as Corradino Astengo had shown in the third volume of the History of Cartography, the 16th century did not abandon the production of Portolan cards, but adapted them to the Atlantic sailing. Now, the Mediterranean was a continuous water battlefield, if I may say so, opposing the Western maritime powers, Spain, Naples, Venice, and the Ottoman power, not speaking about piracy. So the Mediterranean Sea in the 16th century was still a very active region of commercial exchanges, and the demand for cards, navigational tools, but also as geographic artifacts, increased. Cards of the Mediterranean were usually produced in small family workshops, with often some mobility of the card makers from a city to another in search of better markets and customers, or for political reasons. So in the 16th century, the demand was from noble and rich families as for lavishly ornamented cards, or at least with their coats of arms. That's what we are going to see. So the first chart is signed by Domenico Vigliarolo in Naples in 1580. The map represents the entire Mediterranean and a large part of Europe, and is lavishly covered with figures such as wind roses, cities, sovereigns, animals, sea monsters, and a beautiful Pietà on the western part of the map, and boats. Alors, we know about Domenico Vigliarolo. In the beginning of the 16th century, you know that in Naples, Visconte Maggiolo was the main figure of map making. Appointed by the Genoese Republic, he left Naples, and other family came for the card market, notably the Olivas family, who came from Mallorca and settled in Naples. As Corradino Astengo had shown, then all the Oliva family, Domingo and his great son Joan Rizzo, signed cards in Naples until the end of the 16th century. That's a little different from Domenico Vigliarolo. He was a priest born in Stilo in Calabria, and he was in Palermo in Sicilia in 1577. Two cards produced in 1580 in the city of Naples show that Vigliarolo settled there and dedicated himself to the study of cosmography and navigation, and he worked on the design of an instrument that would give an accurate reading of longitude at sea. In 1581, he sent a letter to the King of Spain, and having obtained funds for his journey, he went to Sevilla and he demonstrated his invention a solar clock paired with a compass to determine magnetic declination for the Casa de la Contratación. Alors, during this period, Sancho Gutiérrez was Cosmografo del Rey, and he died. Villarolo, in an attempt to obtain this appointment, presented a number of cards as proof of his ability. And despite the opposition of a piloto mayor, the Italian got the job. So he was Cosmografo del Rey, and a few years later, he returned to Naples, and we know that because he signed 2 cards in the city, and he Hispanicized his name to Don Domingo de Villarreal, and bear the claim to be the cosmographer of His Majesty. He returned to Seville, and he stayed until 1596, and we know that the cartographer Joan Martinez succeeded him as the cosmographer del Rey. Alors, if you see the map, you see that the extension is remarkable with this island in the north, outrepassing the frame of the map. So you have Iceland here. In the northwest, close to the signature there. There are several scales, one for the latitude in the Atlantic. The distortion of the Mediterranean Sea is not corrected, so the general shape of the Mediterranean was not a progress from the situation before, and the cart is heavily decorated. The emphasis is put on the Ottoman ruler of Turkey and of the King of Spain. And one striking point is that the cities are represented far from their actual location. For example, if you look at Paris, you can see Paris here in the middle of France, very far. You can see. I'm sorry, you were just asking me for. So from the beginning, you don't see what I show you. That's terrible. So I did it right. Okay, and here is the pointer. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So if you see Paris is there, very, very far from its exact location. And if you look, you see Marseille, it's very far from the seaside. And so everything is like that on the map. And I show you, you have the ruler of Turkey, and the Ottoman ruler of Turkey, and the ruler of Spain. So it's mostly a political view of the Mediterranean. And the geographical accuracy, well, it's not really important for the map maker. So you have obviously a very beautiful map, richly ornamented, and showing, a state of the political situation in the Mediterranean, but not up to date as well. That's the main point that I wanted to note. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that this map is very close to another map that was already known from Berlin. The Domingo Villarreal of 1580, so the other one made in Naples, and you see the same features and the same Virgin Mary here, but you see the differences. The signature is not in the same place, you don't have the same boats near the Virgin, and the map doesn't show Iceland there. So one of the questions that we have to raise is the reason of the making of such maps and the adaptation of those maps to a special command. I will finish with the other map that was in the Kurt von Figura collection, is the one of Vincent Demetrius Voltius that we heard about this morning, dated August 26, 1598, and signed in Livorno. Demetrius Voltius is an artist born in Ragusa, Dubrovnik, and in a less lavish style, this second card presents the Mediterranean and European coast with a peculiar insertion of another map of the Adriatic Sea in a larger scale. So I hope you can see that. So you have the main shape, habitual, usual, of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, with emphasis on Crimea. And there, you see the Adriatic Sea with a zoom So I hope that it will interest you, that you see the Adriatic Sea here, and in another scale you have the big Adriatic Sea that is put in a free space on the parchment. Alors, it's not the only occurrence of that. I saw it, for example, in the Egerton Atlas in London, when you have the island of Cyprus that is like that, replaced in a blank piece of parchment of the map. So that Voltius, obviously, coming from Dubrovnik, Ragusa, makes an emphasis on his sea, his Adriatic Sea. Another important feature is the enormous coat of arms here that was identified by Corradino Astengo to be the one of Admiral Jacopo Inghirami, Admiral of the Cavalieri di Santo Stefano and native of Volterra in Tuscany. You can see all other features that I will not detail very much, the scales, ornamented scales, the name of the direction here, not very usual on maps, the Virgin Mary again. The style is more Italian, and you have obviously here Italian place names, very close to Benincasa. And the representation of England and Scotland is very close to the Benincasa tradition. For example, you can see the difference between South England and Scotland with this separation here that you can see in 15th century Benincasa atlases very often. So this cartographer, Voltius, who worked in Livorno for the Medici, I will tell you, was obviously taking a tradition of Italian map making. Alors, a few words to finish with Leghorn, donc Livourne, under Duke Alessandro dei Medici, who began the building of the Fortezza Vecchia and had a project of the expansion and modernization of the port of Leghorn for Florence, more than Pisa port. These measures from the Medici made a concrete contribution to the development and prosperity of Leghorn and attracted many people, Jewish bankers and merchants, English and Dutch pilots and captains, navigators from all the Mediterranean settled in Leghorn at this time. Some pilots and some cartographers, such as Robert Dudley, Johann Oliva, Giovanni Battista Cavallini, worked for Leghorn. And thus, in 1561, the Holy Maritime Order of the Knights of San Stefano, Pope and Martyr, was established officially to make the war against piracy. And since it was probably due to the demand from the Grand Dukes, the Knights of Santo Stefano, and the merchant sailors of Tuscany, that some new cartographic workshops were set up in Leghorn during the late 16th century and even in the 7th century, just when in other Mediterranean cities this market was going to decline. A number of extant atlases and cards certainly belonged to the Knights of Santo Stefano. Maybe they used it for lessons of geography, for plotting routes and so on, or planning as atlases, planning attacks. But for sure, we can notice that those maps were essentially made for adornment of libraries. So it was a cultural sign of the Knights of Santo Stefano to possess ornamented cards or atlases. The one of Battista Cavallini, for example, are a good example of those atlases that are in the style of Battista Agnese, but later in the time and well ornamented, but not very accurate in their information. But as Tengo noticed, Leghorn was not there were not a permanent workshop in Leghorn. You have some commissions to different artists that would not stay a long time in Leghorn as this time. However, there's no denying that the city had a specialized cartographic workshops for some moments and were closely bounded to those Knights of Santo Stefano. I will then give you some indications about the census Demetrius Volsius of Ragusa, but not too long. And we'll finish with the one who is kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France to show again some similarities and differences between the one in Heidelberg and those that were already known before this discovery, with strong similarities that show that those workshops were reproducing regularly the same models with adaptation to their owners. For example, the coat of arms in the previous map was added there. In conclusion, the 15th century Mallorcan map, the first one that I show you from Draguignan, shows how the Portolan cards made were appreciated in south of France, probably as we had described in our article about the Latini archives in the Society of Merchants of Ship Owners around the Western Mediterranean and as far as to Bruges, collecting those maps for their personal collections. But during the 16th century, these maps were considered as obsolete and the parchment was so reused. However, magnificent Portolan cards were still appreciated in the 16th and 17th century and made for noble families related to the maritime commerce or to military orders. For example, Giovanni Battista Cavallini or Voltius. These maps of the Mediterranean area had for sure a pedagogic function, but were also the object of memory, devotion, reminding the special link of a family to the sea, and they were, for this reason, kept and transmitted to other generations. And I will end this presentation by quoting Corradino Astengo. There is clearly something surprising about this staying power and vitality in a situation in which printed cards were increasingly available and manuscript cartographers generally showed themselves unable to adapt to the new needs of sailors and changing conditions of the market. Paradoxically, one can argue that the survival of a nautical cartography based on wind rooms was largely due to the fact that such cards gradually lost any practical purpose of navigation aids and took a number of secondary, decorative, and didactic functions as geographical images. However, the main function of these cards was not totally forgotten, as even when the majority of those buying them could no longer be described as sailors, the places of production for nautical cards and atlases continued to be the main ports of the Mediterranean. And I think this conclusion answers some questions that were raised this morning about the less accurate maps of the 16th and the 17th century. Actually, the best well-made maps were made at the beginning of the 14th century, and then they were reproduced during the 14th century for other for geographical reasons. And in the 15th century and 16th century, there were no more than devotional or memory documents for noble families. Thank you. Okay. So I can come back to the maps for the questions. Sure.
So thank you, Emmanuelle, for this great presentation. I'm curious because you showed several charts that have been found in French archives. Is there a reason why they survived more often in French archives, or is it something specific of that region? And why aren't they found in other archives elsewhere in Europe?
Yes, no, it's not only on French archives, actually. I saw the examples that I know the most, but as I told you, in Lucca, there was a discovery in the 21st century. There's in Malta also this map of the Villarolo found in a binding, and I'm sure we will find some other cards in other parts of Europe, but mostly in the Mediterranean area, because there was the market for those kind of maps in the Mediterranean area mostly. Yes.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed it. But to follow up from the previous questioner, and this is a comment really, apropos of other bindings which have the remnants or indeed almost whole charts. I went through the Usher collection in Dublin, and then I decided to go through the East India Office collection. And in my experience, it was where the libraries are not rebound, thus often destroying what was there in the first place. If they did the rebinding in the 19th century, they weren't particularly interested in the previous binding, if you see what I mean. But where you've got the soft vellum binding, you do find quite, not a lot, but you do find the odd one or two charts being used as a binding. The one that I know best is William Burrough, which is in the Usher. In the case of the East India Office, it would seem to be that the charts of John Daniel, who is early 17th century, I can only assume that the charts were maybe in the East India Company, and they just handed the charts over to the binder to get on with it. But otherwise, it's difficult to know, apart from saying as speculation that the parchment was just sold on, but maybe not in the case of the East India Company. Anyway, that's my comment, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I also have a question in relation to the binding, which was fascinating. Do you see, I guess I have two questions. Is it, I don't know very much about these maps that have been used for binding. Do you see early 15th century maps being bound in the late 16th century, or is it consistently older maps?
I was surprised to find a Villarolo map actually used as a binding. So
Yes.
it's not.
This is unusual.
Well, maybe I didn't really made researches about that. I thought it was only medieval 15th century maps that were reused in the 16th century. That's the case for the Bibliothèque Nationale maps. But then I discovered, well, the one from Gap is a later one, is a late 16th or 17th century map. And you have in other archives maybe some maps that were used later than 17th century. Mm-hmm. So, well, we have to make a whole view of that.
Well, I was wondering whether they would be replacing older ones. So early 16th century ones would now be sort of the Portolans to have. So these old ones,
yes.
We can get rid of those and use those for binding. The other question pertains to the ones you showed seem to be, let's say, at least ornamentally, the more simplistic kind. Do you see the highly ornamented ones used for binding as well?
Yes. For example, the one attributed to Petrus Rosselli,
yes,
you see, it's very nice.
Yeah. This also came from binding.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
So it's strange for us that was used for binding because it's beautiful.
But I guess what I was wondering was whether there's an aesthetical consideration when reusing it.
No,
so this is too nice. Depends. Let's not do it with this, but that doesn't seem to be the
Not
case.
necessarily.
Okay, thank you.
So in the interest of keeping time, I think we should
Yes.
move on, but thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you.
Organizing a conference with Steve at UCLA just recently about the interminglings of literature and cartography. And Steve is continuing on that theme with his talk on nautical charts and chivalric literature in the libraries of 15th century Florentine merchants. Steve.
using the mouse. Okay.
There it is.
Which one?
The bottom one.
The bottom one.
McCormick.
Okay,
There we go.
It's in Portuguese.
That's right. Perfect.
Okay, you can pass the slides here with this one.
Is it gonna?
Not showing up. Why? Okay, someone. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers for bringing us together today. My aim is not to talk necessarily about the sea charts that are present in Florentine archives. There's plenty of sources on that. Today, I would like to approach two examples of navigational information that appear within the context of Carolingian texts. In addition to the proximity of navigation in Carolingian historiography, the fact that they were prepared by and for Florentine merchants is noteworthy. I hope to show that the archival and codicological context of a small sampling of mostly textual sources indicate that for merchant book collectors, there existed a logical connection between the aristocratic ethos of a Carolingian epic and professional knowledge that included, among other things, navigational skills and familiarity with Mediterranean geography. These examples reveal that sea charts and navigation treatises had an impact on Florentine merchant identity, and the practical knowledge that they impart entered into the cultural sphere of early 15th century Florence. My talk today will be in 4 short parts. A quick getting up to speed on Old French epic and how it comes to Italy and the notable changes it undergoes. Then I will look at 2 examples that I have been examining in the Florentine archives. One is a silk merchant and who has never traveled outside of Florence. The third is a manuscript at the Ricardiana Library in Florence. And finally, I'll offer a few conclusions on this evidence that I present to you. In the Entrée d'Espagne, an anonymous poet from Milan dazzles readers with an erudite and imaginative prequel to the Chanson de Roland, or the Song of Roland. The language of this early 14th century Carolingian epic is a reader's first hint that they are not reading the medieval French epic of the previous 2 centuries. The Milanese poet writes in an extremely challenging and often enigmatic, made-up language that mixes to varying extents Old French, Venetian, Lombard, Occitan, and Latin. The premise of the Entrée is a clear departure from medieval epic. The knight Roland abandons his feudal vows to defend Charlemagne's empire and, one evening, slips off into the dark to embark on a solitary quest beyond the seas. Often disguised as a merchant, Roland is a seafarer equally at ease on horse as on ship, and he can speak all languages without any trace of accent. Through complex incognito maneuvers and disguises, Roland crisscrosses the Mediterranean Sea, visiting Africa and the Holy Land before ultimately returning to Charlemagne's army. Here, the Entrée hands the narration back to what we know in the Chanson de Roland, where Roland meets a bloody death at Roncevaux. In one of the panel illuminations of the Entrée d'Espagne, this is a manuscript at the Medea-Chart Library in Venice, we witness this metamorphosis of Roland going from one tradition to another. We have a feudal Roland of the Old French epic who enters a dark forest, the liminal space, bringing to mind the liminal space of Arthurian romance, And he emerges on the other side of the Alps, as Orlando, the hero of the merchants and the signori of the Italian peninsula, and the shape-shifting protagonist of a literary tradition that spans uninterrupted in one form or another to this very day. And this is of course, Sicilian Teatro dei Pupi performances. In each cultural sphere of the peninsula, Carolingian epics, stories of Charlemagne and Roland, quickly adapted to new audiences. In 14th century Florence, for example, cantimbanchi, or story singers, recited shortened versions of Carolingian epic called cantari in the piazze, in the town squares. By the end of the century, however, the social economic conditions of the city were quickly shifting, and in this climate of instability, the newly wealthy and politically influential Florentine merchant class sought a way to legitimize and shore up their status. It was in this period that Carolingian cantari, sung in the streets and the piazze, began to attract the attention of Florence's elite, and Orlando, of the Carolingian cast of characters, once again morphed from sung heroes of the piazze to protagonists of sprawling prose elaborations for merchant readers. The merchant elite's turn toward Charlemagne is rooted in a passage from the famous Nuova Cronica of Giovanni Villani, the chronicle of Florence that was left unfinished when Villani died, when the Black Plague washed over the city in 1348. I will read the passage to you. We read in the Chronicles of Florence that after the city was rebuilt according to the wishes of Charlemagne, Emperor and King of France, he left Rome and stopped in Florence on his way back over the mountains through the Alps. He held a great feast and knighted many citizens of Florence. All those living outside the city walls wanted to return within. In a short time, because of the location, the river, and the flat terrain, Florence was bustling with people, with solid walls and canals full of water. Old French epic casts a light of new relevance, became a popular addition to merchant libraries, providing the narrative substance for establishing ties in an origin myth and an impetus for shoring up status and wealth in a rehabilitated vision of feudal aristocracy. If a century earlier, nobility was celebrated as residing in the heart of an individual's capacity to love and feel compassion, the merchant identity of the early 15th century reestablished nobility as a quality transmitted through lineage. The transformations of the matter of Charlemagne within the Florentine context set the stage for custom-tailored texts for a merchant reading audience. The Florentine citizen Andrea da Barberino, reputed for his talent for singing the Carolingian epic in the Piazzetta San Martino, responded to demand by adapting all major Old French epics into long, sprawling tomes, abandoning the epic less in favor of organization in books and chapters. Andrea da Barberino deftly incorporates into his reworkings many of the other intellectual interests that appealed to his merchant audience, including, in his Guerino Meschino, an extensive use of Mappamundi references, Ptolemaic geography, and nautical treatises and references to nautical charts. It is now within the context of Carolingian epic and mercantile Florence that I will interpret two archival studies. The first comes from a silk merchant named Antonio Menetti. Let's see. Manuscript Malabicchiano, 1372, of the Biblioteca Nazionale Centrale of Florence, in the hand of the prolific merchant scribe Antonio Menetti, contains a Portolan and a copy of the Compasso di Navigare. Menetti's interest in such practical navigational knowledge aligns with many other scientific and cosmological works he copied for his personal study, including, among other works, Zucchero Benciveni's Tuscan translation of Johannes Sacrobosco's De Sfera and Restore d'Arezzo's La Composizione del Mondo. If humanists of the previous century, such as Petrarch and Boccaccio, considered geography only insofar as a philological resource to illuminate newly uncovered classical texts, the Florentine merchant copyists like Manetti demonstrate a shift in interest in geography as a source for practical information as it pertained to trade and economic opportunity, and as I'll hope to show, to even daily life in Florence. The surviving collections of merchant copyists also bring into perspective the continued interpretation of practical geographic and navigational knowledge. Although no records exist of Manetti's education, the extent and caliber of his learning is documented in his collaborations with the Benci merchant family, which will be the second case I will discuss, as well as his contacts with Paolo Toscanelli. Born in 1423 in Santo Spirito, the Santo Spirito neighborhood of Florence, and remaining there until his death, Antonio Manetti, like his family, worked as a silk merchant. Despite a sizable corpus of manuscripts written in his hand, as well as a number of his original poetic compositions on cosmological or geographic themes, Manetti's activities as a scholar was ostensibly for personal enrichment and intellectual curiosity. Another of Manetti's manuscripts, Medea-Chart 24157, contains a Tuscan translation of Donato Acciaiuoli's La Vita Caroli, which was, let's see, oh, there it is. This text, The Life of Charlemagne, is sandwiched between a copy of Honorius of Autun's Imago Mundi and a collection of maps at the end of the codex. In 1462, in Tours, France, Acciaiuoli presented his pseudo-epic recounting Charlemagne's life to Louis XI to celebrate his coronation. Following the Carolingian thematics characteristic of Florentine elite culture, the gift was intended to consolidate relations between France and Florence and motivate a motivation that explains the work's narration linking the Medici family lineage to the Emperor Charlemagne. This very brief overview of Manetti's intellectual pursuits leaves us with two pressing questions in my mind. First of all, why would practical navigational texts interest a Florentine merchant? He copied the Portolan and the Compasso di Navigare. And especially, why would it interest him if he had never moved outside of the limits of Santo Spirito? Second, amongst a library heavily slanted toward scientific, geographic, and cosmological concerns, what interest would this reader have in a biography of Emperor Charlemagne? Furthermore, why would the Carolingian biography appear between two geographic texts? Before I propose an interpretation of this archival and codicological situation, I will introduce the second case study, which is the Benci Taddeo family, a merchant bibliophile family whose library, I think, sheds light on the Antonio Manetti archival evidence. Just to clear up a common point of confusion, the Benci family I'm speaking of now has no relationship to the famous Ginevra de Benci, the wet nurse of Leonardo da Vinci in Settignano in the hills above Florence. This is a different branch of the Benci. In fact, in the 1427 Florence Catasto, there are 11 separate branches of the Benci name, and the Benci family that concerns here, like I said, has no direct relationship to Ginevra. The Benci Taddeo branch, with which is associated a coat of arms with a lion's head and 3 stars, flourished as linen merchants, linaiuoli, and its members were active in Florentine politics. Beginning with Giovanni di Taddeo Benci, the first one here, at the end of the 14th century and continuing through to the end of the 15th century, the Benci family passed from generation to generation a tradition of book collecting, and the sizable collection of volumes for family use were often copied by members of the family itself. 28 of these have been identified, and the total number was or is likely considerably higher. The first identifiable volume in the Benci family library is the autographed Zibaldone, or collection of notes, writings, and excerpts of the famous Trecento author Antonio Pucci. This manuscript is now Laurentiana Tempi II. Giovanni di Taddeo Benci either purchased the codex upon the author's passing in 1388 or acquired it as inheritance. Lorenzo, the son of Giovanni, here in the bottom, inherited the volume at some point from his father Giovanni and added a note on July 13, 1399, indicating that he had copied into the volume canzoni from Dante's Vita Nova. Several of Lorenzo's own poetic compositions survive, including a sonnet that imparts to his son Giovanni practical mercantile wisdom. Lorenzo, in turn, had 4 sons, Giovanni, Jacopo, Filippo, and Tommaso, and a daughter, Agnesa. The 4 sons, Giovanni, Jacopo, Filippo, Tommaso, were also took up the tradition of copying texts. Giovanni and Tommaso were recognized or friends with Marsilio Ficino. Filippo was perhaps the most prolific copier of the texts, and Tommaso and Giovanni together spearheaded the family business in Florence. And here is, you see these often in the Benci volumes. The bottom is Lorenzo, signed that he copied this, and he scratched out Giovanni's name at the top. As other merchant readers and book collectors like Antonio Manetti, as we saw, the Benci's family library was well furnished with vernacular texts, especially since Latin was not always guaranteed in the merchant education. As with Manetti, the focus on vernacular text did not detract from the esteem the Benci family held with Florence's most famous humanists, as suggested by the grandfather Giovanni's friendship with Coluccio Salutati. Here again, we notice a shift in trust in regards to geographic sources. If earlier humanists disregarded eyewitness accounts in favor of classically inherited geographic knowledge, by the time Manetti and Benci were active, their interest in practical geographic knowledge does not come at a cost to the friendship with humanists. The identifiable and surviving manuscripts of the Benci library point to notable interest in the topics of natural science and geography. First of all, the Zibaldone of Antonio Pucci ends with a collection of cartographic documents, an important collaboration between Filippo Benci and his brother Tommaso, collating fragments of Restoro's Composizioni del Mondo, resulting in a completed edition of the text, which is now the Vatican Library. The Benci copy of Restoro's treatise appears with 2 family copies of Gorodati's La Sfera, a popular merchant textbook in 15th century Florence. Appended to the same codex are also copies of the Astrologia Secondo Sidrache and the Arcadreo. Another example, also in Filippo's hand and dated to 1449, is a copy of the Dittamondo by Fazio degli Uberti. All these works in the Benci library underscore the enduring influence of cosmology as an epistemological glue that binds topics as diverse as geography, cartography, natural science, and even genealogy, which linked the historical present to the origin myth of Charlemagne. we can already see significant parallels between the Manetti bibliography and that of the Benci family. In fact, like Manetti, Acciaiuoli's biography of Charlemagne appears twice in the Benci library, this time paired with a copy of the Schiatte di Reali di Francia, which is a rewriting of the French epic detailing the genealogy from one generation to another of the French royalty. This, let's see. Lorenzo's father, Lorenzo, the father of the four Benci brothers, likely passed along an appreciation for Carolingian historiography in the Pucci Zibaldone, a margin note in Lorenzo's hand amends a misreading of the Bovo d'Antona epic. And the top is what was passed down in the Pucci's, Antonio Pucci's volume, and Lorenzo notes in the margin that he's confused. I'm not sure if the person who has written this has read well, because Antona, or Hampton, is a port city on the sea in England, or between England and France. I'm not sure how that works, but... And Bovo was the royal lineage of France, descending from Charlemagne. The appreciation for Carolingian epic that Lorenzo passed down to his sons resulted in manuscript 2266 of the Ricardiana Library, a codex that pays homage to the famous Florentine singer and composer of epics, Andrea da Barberino. Manuscript 2266, copied collaboratively between all four of the Benci brothers, contains the earliest extant copy of Andrea's Guerino Meschino. The Guerino text introduces an entirely new protagonist to the Carolingian universe. Also, the protagonist is named Guerino Meschino. And this protagonist embodies Florentine epic's tendency to conflate genealogy, geography, and historiography within the image of the merchant. Although Andrea da Barberino's original manuscript of Guerino is lost, the several early Tuscan witnesses, all of which are all copied in merchant script. Key to the success of Guerino Meschino is its ability to synthesize and incorporate into the matter of Charlemagne those topics that are absent in Old French epic tradition, and yet those topics that are also most interesting to Florentine merchants. These topics, as I'll show in a moment here, evoke sea travel, commentaries of ethics of mercantilism, trade, practical knowledge, and foreign customs. And the illustrations in the Benci volumes are those of Filippo, one of the four brothers, the one who copied most prolifically. And this is a copy of the Benci Aesop Fables, which also includes, notably, geographic sketches in the ending of the manuscript. As Francesco Bottana convincingly argues, the case of the Aesop Benci volume, the brothers recognized the value of Andrea's Guerino as a mechanism for passing on mercantile wisdom and civic virtue to a wide range of readers. And coming back now to 2266 of the Ricardiana, we see often illuminations of the Benci family crest. Filippo drew images evoking chivalry, and I'm not sure if this is a mule, donkey, or a horse. Within these drawings, you see catchwords, and as you flip through the codex, it becomes almost an act of navigating through the text, finding the sign, the catchword that will take you to the next gathering. Here are some more images. There are evocations of sea travel, little ships that fill in blanks and lines. I like that rat. Guerino Meschino, let's see. The opening passages of book 4 of the Guerino Meschino begin with this description of Africa. Guerino arrives to Africa with the help of guides, and the guides tell him that this part of Africa has no ending toward the southern hot regions, the torrid zone, which evoke the Ptolemaic cartography here. And there is no ending because there is a great sea of sand called Libya Arenosa in Ethiopia. The Great Nile River draws the eastern border. The inside sea, or the Mediterranean, forms the northern border, while the Great Ocean Sea forms a western border. Beginning from the west, the following are the regions and kingdoms of Africa. The first and furthest west is Morocco. You can see that Andrea Vagnon opens his book with a description of the Ptolemaic tableau 4, giving a general description of Africa, and then he takes the reader over here, and as I'll show in a minute, the protagonist wanders back along the coast and also through the inland. Now I'm taking Francesco Pizzigano's sea chart, the 1367, because if you have any other suggestions of what sea chart I could draw from, it would be great. But there are certain, thanks to the help of Tony Gamble's maphistory.info website and the extremely valuable toponyms in the Excel sheets of the Medea database project, and also some work that Chet has done in an article in Viator, the Bring on the Monsters and the Marvels. These were all sources that were extremely useful in finding my way through this. And I find that so far the Pizzigano Portolan matches some of the spelling variants in the Benci Guerino Meschino, but I'm not optimistic that there is the Portolan chart we're going to find that matches the text. However, we see here that here's again the detail of the northern coast, and I will read this. This is a passage from chapter 18 of book 4, to give you a sense of what the protagonist sees as he travels through the African continent. In the region called Africa, there are many cities, namely Africa, Sule, and Fakisa. Leaving Africa, you enter into the region of Desertania, and you pass by the Monselic swamps and continue going east. In this region, there are many cities, for example, Caspis, Razamabek, Amugar, and Bultanir. Inland 20 miles, at the base of a mountain called Jiris, there are 3 cities, Baldiak, Ashirin, Tatramana, among many others. There are also 2 rivers, the Sinis and the Sinazer. These unite into one river and enter into the sea at the city of Tripoli of Barbaria. The description he gives in the text follow the order of the cities on the sea chart, and they are also happen to be the cities. They're only the cities that are in red. When the protagonist goes inland, Andrea, the text shifts to the Ptolemaic map, and you can, if you take the Ptolemaic map, you can follow the protagonist as he wanders, for example, up the western coast of Africa. And it's clear that he has a map underneath his eyes because he follows the cities as they appear on the map. If he were looking at the Ptolemaic tables, he would not be able to reproduce that same order. Give another example here. Afterward, you enter into Numidia, arriving toward the east, where there are many cities, and these are the cities, Semelos, Butias. We got a string of them here. And again, we find them on the chart. And this is just a small piece of chapter 18 of book 4, and all 8 books of the Guerrero Miskino draw on different geographic sources to this similar extent. One final interesting passage from the text that I would like to share with you is this. I'll read it to you. I came to find out, this is when Guerrino arrives in the Holy Land. He arrives to Mecca, and he sees the false church, which is a mosque. I came to find out that this inside part of the false church was made of magnet from halfway up, and its color was between black and gray. When the magnet touched one point of a lightweight 4-pointed iron, and thus suspending it, that point that touched the magnet turned north, just as sailors travel safely across the sea with the help of the stars and from looking at the sea chart and the compass of a magnet. And it is for this reason that the Ark of Mohammed is suspended above the iron, since it is the magnet that holds it up. The ignorant Saracen people do not understand how the magnet works. They believe the Ark floats by miracle and not by virtue of its nature. So this is another example of how Andrea da Barberino and the merchant readers would be able to understand, to be able to project this metaphor into questions of faith and heresy from their knowledge of navigation. And finally, a few conclusions. Returning now to where we left Antonio Manetti, our erudite silk merchant. Keeping in mind the case of the Benci Library and the Benci brothers copied Guerrero Miskino. They all 4 took part in copying it. We have at hand a set of compelling literary uses of cartography embedded within the context of Carolingian epic that help us interpret the archival records and intellectual interests of our first case, Antonio Manetti. Florentine archives leave us with the remnants of intellectual passions that suggest surprising uses of geographical and navigational information, an intersection of topics made possible within the cultural environment of the city. It is natural, too, to assume that the long epic, Old French epics would have found many new readers in 15th century Florence when they were written and made relevant to professional preparation and livelihoods. The archival material I've examined speaks to an array of functions beyond the practical education of merchant youth, for example. Aside from notable adventurous Florentine travelers such as Ciriaco, d'Ancona, and Gorodati, travel away from family and business affairs would have been an arduous and costly adventure. For the stationary merchant like Manetti, the information collected in the many volumes of copies would, at the very least, help the professionals understand the destination and provenance of goods sold and purchased. Added reminders of navigational techniques, along with ethnographic information of distant people, would have been useful for understanding the culture and diplomatic prerequisites for receiving goods from overseas markets. Finally, sea travel in the context of chivalric epic allows the reader to draw parallels between the familiar format of a knight-errant's quest and the connect-the-dot progression of a long distance merchant travel. Conceived then as a series of chivalric adventures and in its entirety a quest, the merchant voyage goes far beyond pragmatism and is heightened to a chivalric ideal through which to fashion an ever-shifting civic identity. When Antonio Manetti includes Valentissimo Marinai to the title of his copy of the Portolan, he nods to the utility of seafaring knowledge in his quartiere or neighborhood of Santo Spirito. Thank you.
To translate Marinai as sailor? No. What prompts you to translate the ordinary word marinai for the derogatory word sailor?
That's a good question. I hesitated on that. I'll think about that some more.
Thank you.
I was concerned too about chiamato Portolano, called Portolan. I thought that was a difficult one to translate. And references to maps is always carta, so it's hard to tell if it's map, paper, so it goes back to that.
Very good talk, thank you. Well, first off, sailor is a landlubber's term. From my experience, they refer to themselves as seamen.
Seaman,
So,
okay.
or mariners. Yeah. Anyway, unless my memory fades, I think Da Vinci makes a reference to having he's unable to get to reference his Mappa Mundi because he loaned it out to Benci, and he hasn't gotten it back yet. So I don't know if you're aware of that, but if you're interested, I have a reference somewhere.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I was asking about this interest for technical text copied by Antonio Manetti, and I was wondering if the Pegolotti commercial text, you know that, Francesco Pegolotti, was written in the same circles, because it's also a technical text of the 14th century copied in the 15th century, and it's a true question. I really don't know if it's made in the same circles. It would be interesting.
Yes, and another a colleague of mine who also works on Carolingian epic, Gloria Lair, Italian epic, she talks a lot about Andrea da Barberino's use of this text, Pigoretti, and also other sorts of sources of understanding foreign customs and measurements and whatnot. Yeah, Gloria Lair.
Any more questions before we go to coffee break?
I just wondered, you may not know, but could you go back to the geographical sketch on folio 143 or whatever? Because inevitably, being a mappy person, I just wondered what it depicts. You went past it. There.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a TO or is it a...
It looks like it's the
What's in the middle?
Yeah.
Terra, isn't it?
It's kind of a funny example, actually. The texts that are around it, it's clear that they're talking about eclipses and movements. Of,
right.
Yeah. I'm not too sure what the looks like. It looks like water. Yeah.
Very good. Well,
The tides, actually, yeah, tides.
any further questions?